Mayor Bronin.
Thank you very much. Chairman Fonfara, Chairman Berger, ranking members France and Davis, and members of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today to express my strong support for Senate Bill 464, titled An Act Establishing the Hartford Financial Sustainability Commission. I have submitted written testimony that details our fiscal crisis, addresses how we got here, and why this bill is necessary. Let me begin by saying this. The city of Hartford faces a full-blown fiscal crisis. After getting under the hood and testing every budget number, we currently project a fiscal year 2017 deficit of $48.5 million. That's almost 20% of our non-education budget. When you consider that the vast majority of that $260 million non-education budget is fixed costs, including pension obligations, debt payments, as well as essential services like police, fire, and public works, it's clear that the gap is massive and catastrophic. And to put that in another perspective, you at the state are wrestling with your own crisis. Our shared crisis. You are making cuts that are painful to services that are needed. You will be working next year to close a $1 billion deficit. As a proportion of our budget, if the state shared the same challenge we did, you would have to close a $4 billion deficit next year. And without fundamental changes, it gets worse in the years ahead. Because of debt restructuring in the past, our debt payments will rise by tens of millions of dollars in the next few years, even if we don't borrow another dollar. The gap will soon be so big that even if we eliminated our entire police department and our entire fire department, we would still have a deficit. We cannot raise the mill rate across the board in a city with a mill rate of 74. A property tax rate that is about twice most surrounding towns. To do so would kill the city of Hartford. Maybe slowly, maybe quickly, but surely. What has been proposed in this bill would not eliminate collective bargaining, would not affect any existing contract, would not provide any legal authority to diminish pensions already earned and vested, and would not diminish the power of the Hartford City Council. The bill would give us tools to take responsibility, to ensure that all stakeholders in Hartford are a part of the solution, and to get our house in order. The bill would establish a Financial Sustainability Commission, which would serve as the arbitration panel if we are unable to reach agreements with our municipal unions. The language relating to arbitration is not unprecedented and is based on the legislation that helped the city of Waterbury restructure a decade ago. The bill would also give us authority to determine what the taxpayers can afford to pay into the pension fund, would ensure that state funding isn't stripped away from our schools if, because of this crisis, we're unable to make the full education payment currently required under state law, and would give us the ability to get more help from our largest companies who already pay a great deal in taxes, as well as from our tax-exempt nonprofit institutions. I am asking you to support this bill because it will help us do as much as we possibly can locally to meet this crisis head-on. If this bill passes, the next step would be negotiation with labor unions, with companies, with nonprofits. I am ready to negotiate and hopeful that the negotiation would yield agreement. But where contracts have been in negotiation since before I took office, we cannot afford to be bound by the offers made by the last administration. And if negotiations reach an impasse, the final referee must be a body that has as the financial sustainability of our capital city as its primary mission. Our budget gap is so big that even if we are able to obtain substantial savings from contract negotiations, and even if we are able to get help from Hartford's largest institutions, we will still have no choice but to make deep cuts in a city where staffing is already lean. If we are not able to find substantial savings and additional revenue, we will quite simply be unable to close the gap. Now, I want to be very clear. Even the deepest cuts, the most painful concessions, the elimination of services, and even the most generous help from large companies and tax-exempt institutions, all of that will only get us part of the way to closing the gap in the years ahead. The city of Hartford is less than 18 square miles. More than half of our property is tax-exempt. We are home to state government and to nonprofits that serve the region and the state but which pay no taxes to the city of Hartford. We house a vastly disproportionate share of the region's social service providers, halfway houses, shelters, and clinics, and we serve neighborhoods that are among the poorest in the nation. Hartford's tax base is simply not adequate to support what we must do as a city. So the state of Connecticut has some soul searching to do. Yes, I am asking you to support this bill, but we need to have a much bigger conversation about how we can build Connecticut cities into vibrant, strong urban centers. Cities that will help us keep our young people close to home, cities that will help us attract the next generation of innovators and entrepreneurs, cities that will help Connecticut compete for the largest employers in the world, not lose them, and cities where we don't have thousands of men and women standing in line for hours on a Saturday before Easter to compete for a few part-time jobs at a ballpark because there are so few jobs to be found. Hartford is the economic and cultural center of a region of more than 1 million people, and every town in the region has a stake not only in Hartford's survival, but in Hartford's success. We must have that bigger conversation. We must have it quickly. But in the meantime, I ask for your support on this bill. I have the deepest respect for public employees and for labor. And I have profound respect for those of you who serve in uniform in our police departments and fire services. You put your life on the line to make our communities and our citizens safer, and there is no city in the country that could possibly compensate you adequately for the risks that you take on our behalf. But defeating this bill will not make things better or easier for anyone. The challenge we face is so big that we must begin to contemplate paths forward that would in other times be unthinkable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Senator Bumper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mayor. Thank you for your testimony. You may or may not have heard the beginning of Councilwoman Bermudez's testimony. I don't know if you were in the room yet for it, but she testified that your office has, I'm paraphrasing, your office has not yet demonstrated that the crisis is so great to warrant drastic steps such as this bill would require. Could you comment, if you're willing to the extent that you have communicated beyond your testimony here today, if your testimony here today may be additional information than others have heard? I don't know. Somebody just hit the switch. Thank
Deficit
you.
mitigation.
Yeah. That's where we're heading. If you could help the committee understand, to the extent that you have have provided information, and if you haven't yet, in addition to comments made regarding your discussions with representatives of labor.
Sure.
Please, thank you.
So, first of all, the city of Hartford has been facing structural deficits for many years. This is not a new problem. What is new is that we are out of one-time fixes. And I'm not willing to just sweep problems under the rug. If you look back at the last 4 years in Hartford and you take out the one-time revenues like selling parking garages or raiding employee benefit reserves that have been built up over time, if you take those out, the city of Hartford's been running $20 to $40 million deficits in each of the last 4 years. So this is not a new problem. The city of Hartford has one more parking garage to sell. I don't think it's responsible to take a long-term revenue stream and mortgage the future by selling it now. It just postpones the day of reckoning. And there's not a lot of other one-time revenue out there. You guys are facing a similar challenge on the state level. As I said, as a proportion of the budget, ours is even larger. I have extended an invitation, and I extend it to anyone today, either on this committee or representatives of our municipal unions and certainly our city council, to sit with our budget team, the budget director, the finance team, and go through the numbers in detail. We have nothing to conceal and welcome the opportunity to walk through those numbers. But as I said in my testimony, our current estimate is that next year's deficit is $48.5 million. I don't think we can raise our mill rate above 74 without destroying this city. So there are very few options. There will be cuts. The cuts will be deep. But there's a limit to how much you can cut when you're only providing basic services already. If we can't find substantial savings in our contracts, then there will have to be even deeper cuts. I think cuts that are so deep that they're irresponsible, that we cannot sustain them. And as I said in testimony, that leaves us in a position where we may not be able to close the gap. Now, a part of this is also giving us the tools to get our largest institutions and our nonprofits to the table and ask them to be part of the solution. I don't think they will come to the table in the absence of a broader effort to share the burden of restructuring city government. I'm happy to answer any more specific questions. Let me also just say this. As I mentioned briefly in the testimony, our problem isn't just 2017. Past administrations restructured Hartford's debt, refinanced it multiple times. We will, in this year's fiscal year 16, we will be paying $10 million towards debt service. Because of the restructuring that was done in the past, next year we will pay $30 million. The year after that, $40 million, and the year after that, $50 million. And again, that's if we don't borrow a single dollar more. So the structural challenge we face today is not a one-year hump to get over. If it were, I might be willing to sell a parking garage and piece together some one-time solution to get us over the hump. That's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a crisis that escalates. So if we don't make structural changes, it will soon exceed our ability to manage it.
Senator Pfeffer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mayor. This committee has a decision to make. I said the beginning of this testimony with respect to this legislation. As you indicated in your remarks, this is not an easy request. This is not whether we want to paint school buses green or keep them yellow. And there are people sitting behind you and facing us who have been part of a process for years of getting to where they are and realizing the salary and benefit package that they have and the structure of the manpower of the fire department, police department, and other unions. That didn't come easy. Whether some of those decisions were in the best interest of the city when they were made is certainly debatable, but there were decisions that were made that labor they were willing to forego in return for other benefits. That's a process that we have not been a part of. But I think it's important that whatever we do here, that it be credible and hopefully supported, may not be enthusiastic support, that is supported by all parties. I hope that between now and when this bill has to be acted upon, either favorably or otherwise, that those conversations will take place, that all parties recognize that the taxpayers of Hartford, of which many of whom I represent, and Representative R.C. and Senator Coleman and other members from Hartford of this committee represent personally, cannot be left without the adequate services that are necessary to be provided, including by the people, very people in this room who put their lives on the line every day. And so this is a delicate situation that I hope responsible people will come to the table and recognize the greater good, and that means sacrifice on everyone's part, that it's, as our governor said some time ago when the state was facing a prior crisis, that it's about shared responsibility and shared sacrifice. But that can only come with dialogue, with serious discussions that I'm hopeful, as one member of this committee, will take place before we have to make a decision, and that any action that this committee takes would be with the support of all parties. Thank you, Mayor, for being here today.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Bronin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here this afternoon. I think you're one guy in the state I don't envy. I don't doubt for a minute how dire the situation is in Hartford. However, I do have a question. In your opening remarks, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going to paraphrase, you said you didn't want to do away with collective bargaining, and that essentially this panel that we're proposing today would basically have the final say. And to me, it comes across as you are doing away with collective bargaining, because the essence of collective bargaining is if you come to an impasse or you can't agree, that you would have a third-party arbitrator deciding the case. And as part, an existing process now, as part of the process, that arbitrator, when reviewing a case, they do look at the town or city's ability to pay. So how would this panel differ from the existing practice that is set up statewide now? If you can shed some light on that, I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much, Representative. Let me first say that, as I said in my testimony, regardless of whether the bill is approved, the next step is negotiation. And facing a crisis on the scale that we're facing, I am hopeful that there would be an agreement reached. The panel that this bill would create would take the place of the traditional arbitration panel, and it would have representation from the city. So the extent that a criticism is that there are those who have a stake in those negotiations serving on the panel, that is correct. And the reason that's necessary is that we have to have some greater ability in a crisis like this to shape the ultimate outcome of contracts that will determine whether the city of Hartford can survive as an independent financial entity. There are many versions of collective bargaining. Connecticut's is not the only one. In fact, in many states in New England, arbitration panels have no ability to impose a result on a city when it comes to financial matters. For example, in the state of Rhode Island, which does not have a reputation as being an unfriendly state to organized labor, there is no binding arbitration on financial matters. In many other New England states, there are alternative processes where the legislative body of the city retains the ultimate say on whether an agreement that imposes costs on the taxpayers of that city goes forward. So what I proposed is quite clearly a change for a limited period of time to what has been the traditional arbitration process in Connecticut. But as mentioned, it's not unprecedented. It's based on what has been done in other Connecticut cities in times of crisis. It's for a short period of time. and it's a response to a dire crisis where the alternatives are worse.
And again, I don't doubt you, Mr. Mayor. The other question that I had was, you had said that if you did away with police and fire, it still wouldn't take care of the problem. So if you were given the authority and if collective bargaining would be changed to the extent it's being proposed today, what kind of changes are we looking at?
Sure, and just to be
In some.
sure, and
fairness.
just to be clear with that, when I say that, as I said, that's in the years ahead. So a couple of years from now. That's not the case in 2017, although in 2017 it is a massive deficit. But a few years out, the deficit grows so big that even eliminating those departments would not close the gap. Needless to say, I'm not and would not under any circumstances propose that. That is meant to demonstrate the size of the gap. We as a city must continue to provide the essential services that we provide to our residents, no matter what avenue that forces us down. What we need to do is, number one, obtain as much savings as we can through changes to contract. That will be in salary, it will be in benefits, will be in pension. These are prospective changes going forward, not changing pensions earned. We'll have to obtain as much savings as we can there. In some cases, I think that means looking at the numbers of employees in a particular department. I'm not just talking about police and fire, I'm talking across the board. The vast majority of our costs are in personnel. That's the nature of any municipal government. And certainly the vast majority of the costs that we can in any way control. So there will have to be changes in contract benefits. There will have to be, beyond that, cuts that are still extremely deep. There is no way to move forward without cuts in services that the city currently provides. And let me be clear again, the city of Hartford does not have a lot of fat. There are legacy costs that I think were the result of irresponsible decisions and irresponsible promises. There are pensions being paid today that I think are unjustifiable when we're talking about a city that's one of the poorest in the country. But currently, our active employee base is not too big. In fact, most of our departments at the low ebb, smaller than they've been in many years. So there's not a lot of fat to cut. We will be cutting muscle, we will be cutting bone because we have no option. But all of that, as I said in my testimony, only gets us a part of the way. Another piece is to try to get the institutions that are part of our Hartford community, the largest taxpayers who already do a lot, and the tax exempts who serve our community and serve the entire state but who don't pay taxes, to get them to come to the table and add additional revenue. And even then, in 2017, we would still be draining the remainder of our fund balance, the remainder of our rainy day fund. So all of that only buys us time to have that bigger conversation that I talked about. And there were comments made by the Working Families Party members of a city council that I absolutely agree with. We have to have that bigger conversation about how we operate as a region and as a state to sustain our cities that are too poor to deliver the kind of services they need and whose tax base is inadequate to become the kind of cities we would want to have if we really want to compete nationally.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Ars.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here today and for your testimony. I want to thank you for coming forward and acknowledging that Hartford does have a crisis, and to bring that to the attention of the people of the city of Hartford, the people that I represent. I wouldn't want to see this city go into bankruptcy. I would want to see this city become another Detroit. And I'm very concerned about that. And I'm hoping that all parties could come into an agreement. I think it's important that all parties sit and hopefully come with some kind of agreement that will save our city. As I'm writing in this morning, Elaine Hatcher gave me a call. And it was very disturbing. And when she said to me, and I will be leaving for a little bit out of the committee later on because there's some phone calls that I have to make. A pregnant woman, nowhere to live, living under a bridge. Those are some of the things that are happening in our city. A pregnant woman living under a bridge. I know that Hartford is in big financial crisis. And I'm hoping that all parties, council, unions, mayor's office, could sit down and come up with some kind of resolution or solution on this matter. This is a very delicate matter because the last thing I would like to see is more pregnant women under a bridge. So I am asking that just last week the delegation met with the unions, and we did ask the unions to reach out to council as well as your office because we hear rumors here, rumors there, and somebody say this and somebody say that. And I think that the best way to resolve the problems is when everyone is in the room and everyone is in whatever negotiations. So I'm hoping that something happens soon. I'm hoping that talks get underway because the last thing I want to see is more pregnant women under a bridge. And that's a situation that I'm going to have to leave this committee in a few minutes to go deal with to make sure that this pregnant woman find a place for her to sleep in a safe place. So I am urging everyone, the unions, the council, the mayor office, to come together and hope that you could come up with a solution on this issue with our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I don't have your testimony. It hasn't come through. I think my computer's suffering from budget issues. But I understand and respect your position coming in here. You're a recently elected mayor. You're dealing with issues that certainly you had no doing in. You were not negotiating. You were not dealing anything. I'll talk a little bit about substance. I do have a couple of questions, but talk about substance. You know, you've come through, and I think some of the biggest frustrations I and some others may have is for all the men and women, and it's not, there seems to be a plethora of firefighters here, but I know I've spoken to police folks, I've spoken to teachers, I've spoken to people that perform social services in the city of Hartford, and when a piece of legislation like this comes forward, I think for the good, hardworking people that provide the services to the people of the city of Hartford, it's like a 2x4 hits you right between the eyes, right? We all know things are bad. Any of us that can read, any of us that can hear news, any of us that pay any bit of attention know things are bad at your level and ours. But I think these folks feel like they've just taken it across the head with a lack of respect. And I think, I guess the question, I have a couple, but have you had the chance, have there been formal discussions before this piece of legislation even came out with the bargaining units to say, hey, we have problems, let's get to the table?
Thanks, Representative Morin. I have. Now, we have not had, we have a number of unions, a number of contracts. which are at various stages. Some are in arbitration. Some have been in negotiation for such a long time that I'm locked out from putting new issues on the table. Some will be just beginning. I have had those conversations. I have not with every union had extended, detailed negotiations. And if this legislature, if our General Assembly were a full-time legislature that did not go out of session only a few weeks from now, I would not have proposed this bill when we did. But you do go out of session in a few weeks, and the deadline for considering any new legislation passed the day this bill was submitted. What we can't do as a city is put ourselves in this position where we are building some unknown guess of what savings we could achieve in our contract into our budget, and then find, as in years past, that those savings don't materialize. The stakes for the city of Hartford are too high for us to do that. So we need to have a greater level of certainty that we could achieve the savings we will need to even close our books in this coming fiscal year. I have an enormous amount of respect for everybody who goes into public service. And I have a deep, deep respect for everyone who puts their life on the line for our communities. In putting this bill forward, I mean no disrespect. But my highest obligation is to the taxpayers of the city of Hartford and to the future of the city of Hartford, and to ensure that we can get the city of Hartford through a crisis and on a path to growth. I will, no matter what, negotiate. I will, no matter what, respect the hard and dangerous work that many city employees do while we're in those negotiations. The calendar dictated a need to put legislation forward when we did. And I believe that since my highest obligation is to the city's taxpayers and to the future, it was a difficult but right thing to do.
So thank you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chair. I just have a little more, and I do need to recognize that the city does have the and this probably isn't the right way to say it, but the handicap of having so many state and not-for-profits. Representative Arce is talking about a homeless person. I personally volunteer at South Park Inn Homeless Shelter. I understand the need. I've had Senator Fonfara in there. I know he's gone in and spoken to the people, and that does create, it's kind of a catch-22 because you're providing services for the people that really need it and the people that are down on their luck, but it also does not generate anything for the city. So I get where you're going, but I'm going to go back to this is we're in the ability to try to have some goodwill between the men and women that perform these services and the mayor's office and this body. I think, and again, I get it, time constraints. Have you put forth, like, to the union leadership, all of them, opportunity to say, listen, we need to have some formal conversations. We need to have them now, and engage, because we don't really know where we would be if we don't have these discussions. And maybe it would result in an impasse, but we really don't know that.
You're right, we can't know that, although in the conversations that I've had, and every conversation is different, I believe that on key issues that matter, there would very likely have been an impasse. Had enough discussion about the size of the challenge we face to know that there was a reluctance to acknowledge it. And I did not come away from those discussions thinking that it was going to be anything other than business as usual. But I understand your point, and I respect it.
Okay, and so what? And I might know the answer to some of this, but others don't. Things are, you've said, and I wish I had your testimony in front of me, but you've said, things may or have to be done differently. Are you engaged in any policies or procedures within the communities, surrounding communities, that might help the city work more efficiently?
Thanks, Representative. I have had a number of conversations with mayors or first selectmen of surrounding towns. I made a presentation at the Capital Region Council of Governments only a week ago that Senator Cassano can attest to as he was there, where I made an impassioned plea. I think we are at a moment of crisis, not just in the city, but in the state. And we have to figure out how to start operating regionally. We've had a conversation about regionalism for decades in this state, but we've done very little about it. And I believe we're running out of time. Again, not just as a city, but as a state. Too often the conversation about regionalism starts with, well, you know, we're so stuck in our New England ways that we've got to find some small symbolic ways to share costs or share services. You know, let's share a dog catcher, or let's share some IT services. And I understand how deeply rooted our provincialism is, but if we don't start having that conversation much more seriously and much more aggressively, and putting things on the table that we're not afraid to put on the table because of their political cost, I think we as a state will condemn ourselves to a future of decline. We cannot compete with the Louisvilles and the Pittsburghs and the Atlantas and the Charlottes and on around this country if we don't figure out how to stop duplicating costs across every single one of our 169 towns. So I have had that conversation. But I would say we as a state need to push that conversation to a different level because we are running out of time.
Thank you, Mayor. And last point and last question. Again, I'm going to ask that you formally reach out to every leader of the bargaining units and have an open discussion with them and a fair discussion with them. And my concern, as well as this, what the language is, and I've read through it numerous times because it's not always as clear as we might like it. I have a real concern with this, with the language as it states, where if things are collectively bargained or not agreed upon, that that body that's going to be created is going to be able to just circumvent things. And that's a real concern for me personally, and it may be for some others on this committee, but that's why I'm going to continue to push for you, Mr. Mayor, and the bargaining units and the people of Hartford to work together and work with the leadership of this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me this lengthy opportunity. It's appreciated.
Thank you, Representative, and also for committee members. I know you have a lot of testimony before you, but I believe you'll find the mayor's testimony in the bottom of this pile. So it's what resign, I think the written is in the copy here. So, Representative Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Mayor, I got to say, I totally understand where you're coming from. You know, there's nobody on this panel right here who doesn't know that we're in the same boat right now, you and I, and I don't envy the position you're in. I will take major disagreement with one issue. You said we're almost out of time. We're out of time. There's no question about that. Now, with that, I have a couple of short questions. First off, I know you said there's about a $46 million deficit. What is the current debt of the city? What's that number?
I don't want to quote you the wrong number. I can't tell you the aggregate debt. I can tell you the debt service. So the debt service, absent a one-time shot of bond premium, which was about $12 million this year, and offset our debt service. Our debt service this year would have been just over $20 million, $22 million. In our budget, we're paying $10 million toward debt service this year. Next year it rises to 30, then 40, then 50. It hovers around 40 and 50. If you include on top of that an assumption that we will do an additional $50 million of capital investment, which in the city of Hartford is lower than it has historically been, you will add another $4 million on top of that. And if you, and all of this, by the way, assumes that we get back 100% of the revenue from the downtown north stadium development that was projected, and I will not say that I have confidence in those projections.
I understand. And what is the current budget of the state, the annual budget, or excuse me, of Hartford?
The annual combined budget of city and Board of Education is approximately $530 million.
Okay.
The city side, current services for fiscal year 2017, approximately $263 million.
Okay. Write that down. Okay, so the last question, and the part of this that I've been most interested in understanding is the concept of whether or not you're bypassing the council. And, the way it's listed in the bill, it explains that this commission will make the rule, make whatever the ruling is, whatever the requirement will be, and the council will have to vote it down, basically, with a vote of 5 to, I think there's 9 on the council, is that correct?
Correct.
Why wasn't it written in a place where the council would have consent, instead of saying the council would have to consent with what the board did?
I think in either circumstance, the will of the council prevails. A majority of the council determines whether to accept or reject that recommendation. In either approach, 5 votes decides the matter. So a majority of the council can reject any recommendation that's made by the city council, by the commission. I'm not wed to that. I'm perfectly comfortable flipping that. But I will say I do think it's important that the commission, which again has as its mission the financial sustainability, make the recommendations and that they be taken seriously.
And I understand that completely, and I'm glad to hear that you're not wed to that, because frankly, if we're in the same boat, and if the governor came to us right now and said he wanted full autonomy with a board that he wanted to put together, and said the legislature couldn't, we didn't have any consent and our opinion didn't matter, I think we'd take issue with that. And I think most of my constituents would too.
Understood.
So-
I think it's important that the consent, I think there is consent in the sense that a majority of members of the council will have their will prevail. So a majority, regardless, just like it takes 5 votes of the city council to enact any provision of a budget, it would take 5 votes of the council to decide which direction the city council wanted to go on any particular matter. But I certainly understand your point, and I'm not wed to it.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Carter. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mayor, for being here today. And as I mentioned before, as you testified before us, I certainly appreciate your willingness to finally recognize the difficulties of the financial situation in the city of Hartford. And I think many of us here on this committee and across the legislature find that to be a bit of a breath of fresh air, that finally the leadership in the city are recognizing that the path that they've been on is not one that's sustainable for the near future. I certainly have concerns about us stepping into the interior functions of the city of Hartford as a state legislature. And my first question would be, have you exhausted every available option to you before coming before us with this bill?
So again, we're in the middle of our budget process. I will submit my budget to council on April 18th. We're in the middle of some negotiations. We have others that are more advanced stage of that process, including in arbitration. Not all of those processes have run their full course, but your legislative session is about to run its full course. And that is what required me to put this forward when we did.
And what would happen if we did not act on this bill this year and you were forced to have to make some of these changes yourself as a city council or as a mayor?
Well, we don't necessarily have the ability to make those changes by ourselves. That's the problem. Ultimately, the fate of the city's finances, at least that portion of our savings that we would seek to obtain through changes in contracts, would rest in the hands of a 3-person arbitration panel, none of whom are elected by any resident of the city of Hartford. And they would hold in their hands the ultimate decision about what costs the city would have to bear. So we would be rolling the dice. We would be rolling the dice at a time when every dollar counts and we are on the brink.
And I noticed in your testimony and in your discussions that there's very little, if no mention, especially in the commission, the way the commission would be set up, of the education side of the budget, which makes up a significant portion of the city's budget. And I was just wondering, where do they play into this situation of the financial calamity of the city of Hartford?
There is in the bill a similar provision which would allow the commission to make recommendations to the Board of Ed, which a majority of the Board of Ed could choose to reject. So that provision is mirrored on the Board of Ed side, and precisely to your point, I think it provides an opportunity for us for a body to look through that Board of Education budget and see where there are opportunities to find savings. But I will say this, the City of Hartford's, just like the City of Hartford's city-side operations does not have a lot of fat. There's not an awful lot of fat in the Board of Ed budget either. The Board of Ed side has their own deficit this year, on top of our $48.5 million deficit. They are making cuts. They're making cuts in positions that should not be cut. Cuts in positions that serve some of our neediest kids in a city where some of our schools have more than 50% of their school population either special education needs or English language learners. There's not a lot of room to cut there, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look.
And how do you explain, for instance, to my constituents that in a suburb of the city of Hartford, many of which either work in the city or work for the city, how do we respond to the idea that you have now come before us after giving the state of Connecticut giving tremendous amounts of money to the city of Hartford over many, many years, and we now find out that the city of Hartford is in such financial problems because of one-time fixes and various other things that have happened? How do we respond to the question of this is the responsibility of the city of Hartford? Why does it have to be the responsibility of the state of Connecticut to step in and take over?
Well, I guess my first answer is that's precisely what I'm asking you for. I'm asking you for the tools to allow me to take responsibility and allow the city of Hartford to take responsibility to get our own house in order. This bill does not have a fiscal note of $60 million attached to it, although what I'd really like to ask for is that the state of Connecticut give us $60 million. Or $70 million. I'm not putting that bill before you, even though I think I should. I understand you face a crisis. I'm not asking you for a bailout in this bill, although I don't think we can postpone that conversation for long. What I'm asking you for is the tools to take action on our own, to take responsibility, to get our own house in order as much as we possibly can. And if I could, just to that point, in my written testimony, you'll see another point about the deficit we face. In a lot of ways, I think the $48.5 million deficit is the wrong number to use, both because it gets worse in the long run and because at a 74 mil tax rate, our ability to grow the city out of the problem is severely limited. So if you really want to talk about the deficit that matters, it's the deficit between our expenditures and the revenues we'd get if we had a mill rate that was competitive. So if we had a mill rate that was 45, which is still higher than almost any town in the region, our deficit would be north of $100 million. That should demonstrate that while part of the problem is mistakes of the past, part of the problem is benefits and pension obligations that we had no business as a city in our financial shape agreeing to. Part of the problem is buildings that should never have been built and stadiums that should never have been built. That's all true. But if you take all that away, we still have a structural problem because our city is one of the poorest in the country and its tax base is inadequate to serve the residents of the city of Hartford and the institutions that support the entire state.
Would you support a similar commission to be developed in another city or town in the state that faces similar situations, if in fact they do? Say either a large city like City of New Haven or City of Bridgeport, or a small town like Franklin or Lebanon or Bridgewater.
You know, I'm not going to answer in the hypothetical. I would look at the circumstances. I would want to understand how big that problem is and how insurmountable it is otherwise. But can I, do you mind if I answer one other piece of your earlier question as to why your residents should care? Mm-hmm. Because Hartford's success or failure will be very quickly reflected in your town's success or failure. If we decline, that decline will be reflected in home prices, in home sales, in unemployment numbers, in all of the surrounding towns. And if we figure out how to get this ship righted and start growing the city of Hartford again and making it a place that can attract businesses, not one that's constantly afraid of losing them, where we can bring employment in and promote innovation entrepreneurship, as a region, we will feel the impact of that. Because if you take the entire CROG region, the entire Capital Region Council of Governments region, and put it all together, it's still smaller than most small cities in the country. If we don't start thinking of our economic fates as linked, we will not win the war.
And I appreciate that answer. I mean, I think it is important for us to recognize that the vibrancy of the surrounding communities of the city of Hartford is dependent upon the success of the city of Hartford. And I don't think there's anybody on this committee that does not want to see Hartford succeed. And certainly we all want to see it do even better than it has, and even better than it did in the past when it was such a vibrant city. My concern with this bill potentially going forward in the way that it's drafted, and I understand it could be changed, is that from your own testimony here today that we have not exhausted all of the options before the city of Hartford, and that for us to move forward and do this rather unprecedented move, although a similar situation was done in Waterbury, I feel that we are putting perhaps the cart before the horse here, that you have not run all the courses that you can run in order to make the city of Hartford right, and then come to us and say, listen, we've tried everything we can, we cut what we had to cut, we tried to renegotiate these contracts and the unions failed to come to the table, or various other options that are before us. And I understand your concern that there's only a few weeks left, but this is a rather unprecedented move for the state of Connecticut to do this. It's only been done in Waterbury, from my understanding, before in the past, and that I just fear that by us doing this now, before everything's exhausted, sets a precedent that perhaps cannot be turned back in the future for other cities and towns in the state of Connecticut.
Can I respond briefly?
I would allow you if the chairman.
If by exhausting every option you mean pursuing every contract negotiation to conclusion, which is a lengthy process, which could end in arbitration, where we won't know the outcome of that arbitration, and where once that arbitration is decided, we are locked in for a term of a contract, 3 years, 4 years, however long that term is, we will have lost the opportunity to make those changes. So if by exhausting all options, you mean closing the door on any alternatives, you're right, we haven't. But that's why we need to have this discussion now.
Thank you, and I thank you for your honest discussion here with us here in the state legislature about what the city of Hartford faces, and I think it's something that we do have to contemplate very carefully moving forward. And I appreciate the testimony here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Alexander, you wish to be recognized by? Very good, Representative. Thank you, Representative. Senator Fonfair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One comment and a final question from me. Just to put things in proper perspective, when we talk about the obligations of cities in Connecticut, and in particular the city of Hartford, which is by far has the most obligations and services the poorest communities of any in this state, including our cities, by far. And within walking distance of this building, there are 3 homeless shelters, halfway houses, a methadone clinic. We house the greatest number of low-income and have the greatest number of low-income, dedicated low-income housing units and affordable housing, and more social services than anywhere else in the state by far. We handle not just Hartford's problems, but the region's problems and beyond. The Corrections Department drops off people within walking distance in Park and Main, folks that are leaving prison. Whether they're from Hartford or they're not, they leave them there. And that's Hartford's obligation from that point forward. Mayor, I think you indicated earlier that you'd be willing to allow the council in this legislation to allow the council to pass by an affirmative vote if that were included in our legislation. And again, I think everyone here hopes that a priority that, as Representative Arce indicated earlier, that good people can come together where this legislation were not needed. And I can tell this committee and those in this room that in discussions with the mayor that he asked if there were a way to not have this legislation come before us until the last possible day, with the hope of having to ameliorate the need for it. But if there is not an ability to come together, if that isn't the eventual conclusion to the discussions, what is your option as the mayor of the city of Hartford, ultimately?
Senator, we will first cut everything we think we could responsibly cut. And then we would cut things that we could not responsibly cut. And then we would ask our tax-exempt institutions to come to the table and help, even if we can't guarantee them that we're going to be getting savings from contract negotiations. And we would ask our largest employers, who pay 74 mills, to come to the table and give us more money, even though they've chosen to remain in Hartford, pay more taxes than they would pay anywhere else, and even though we can't assure them that we would be finding savings through our contract changes. We would do all that. We would exhaust our fund balance. And it may or may not be sufficient.
And if it isn't?
I would rather not talk about all avenues that, you know, we would be forced to contemplate in that situation.
Would ultimately you be required to hand over the decisions to another body?
If we get to the point that we are not able to deliver the essential services that we as a city are obligated to deliver, and we don't have sufficient revenue to cover our costs of doing that, then it's entirely possible that the paths forward involve a loss of control.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any other questions or comments from committee members? Seeing none, thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much.
Mayor O'Leary, City of Waterbury.